Hello, Mr. Davis. Welcome to this episode of Today on Wall Street. We're so great to have you here. So, Mr. Davis, your name is well known to this audience. We know you from your reporting on relations between the United States and China, and especially from your book with co-author Ms. Lingling Wei. And just this month, you retired from the Wall Street Journal after 39 years at the newspaper. So before we get started, I wonder if you can introduce yourself a little bit more to our audience. What got you interested in China, and how does your career path intersect with China?
Well, thanks for inviting me here. Yes, it is coincidental, but I just retired November 1st after, as you say, 39 years. I always wanted to be a reporter, and I traced that back, to when I was a kid. My father made luggage in a factory in Brooklyn. He didn't face Chinese competition at that point, but did face Asian competition, Korea, at that moment. It took me quite a while, honestly, to realize I was covering the same forces that had battered, honestly, my father and his company. But in the 1990s, I covered the Clinton administration. That was an administration and a White House that cared a lot about trade and a lot about China in a very positive way, I would say. And so I started covering it back then. I've been interested in it since then. 2011 to 14, I lived there and reported from there, and basically kept reporting on it after I got back. So it's, China's an issue that has kind of intrigued me from the start, and kind of my career kind of followed along with it.
Right. And speaking of the book you wrote with Ms. Lingling Wei, Superpower Showdown, we've recommended the book multiple times to our audience, and I still think it's the most authoritative account of the inside stories of the U.S.-China trade war years. So I'm curious, I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about the background of the book. What was the process of writing that book like? As a writer myself, I'm especially interested in coordination of the logistics. How do you and Ms. Wei coordinate your reporting spanning the 12-hour time difference?
Well, as I said, I was based in China from 2011 to 14. Lingling came there about 6 months after I did, so we worked together, very closely on a number of what I would consider major stories. Then after I got back, as I say, I reported out of Washington, she reported out of Beijing. It was funny. I mean, it actually worked to both of our advantages. The U.S.-China became a huge issue as the relations between the two countries worsened. And so I would get a tip during the day, pass it on to Lingling at night, and she would work her sources, and vice versa. She'd hear things, and on Beijing time, let me know. I try to, confirm it or add to it in Washington. It helped both of us, because I think officials in both countries understood that we were talking to the other side, and that we had sources of information that sometimes they didn't have, and also that it was harder to pull something over our eyes, although never impossible. Reporters are always dealing with that kind of issue.
Right. Fantastic. And you guys produced a huge number of fantastic scoops during those years. But, honestly, the moment that I remember most clearly was this article you wrote, which apparently so irritated the Trump White House that then USTR Ambassador Lighthizer took the rare move to call you two out by name, calling it fake news. Even though what's really interesting is Bloomberg actually reported a similar story later on about how, haircuts on Chinese tariff was going to be featured in the trade deal. So why do you think the White House took it out on YouTube specifically?
Well, I think in some way, I hope this doesn't sound immodest, but I think we were the main reporters, honestly, on the story. So, I mean, there was more attention paid to what we were reporting. I think that was part of it. I mean, Bloomberg, as you say, did report something similar. I think some other publications also had it. I think, remember the Trump White House was, to say the least, a very unusual place. So Ambassador Lighthizer had negotiated a deal. He felt that he had gotten a really good deal from the Chinese, and that our story came out exactly at the moment he was trying to announce, what he thought was a very good deal. Ours indicated that they might accept something a lot less. think he was, honestly, I just think he was angry. And then he has a boss like Trump who's, couldn't, look for any reason to sort of jump on the press. So I think he was under some pressure probably to put out the kind of statement he did. Lingling and I also, when we were in Beijing, we had a similar denouncement by name from the central bank. So, my son said, "Oh, you should frame them, next to each other." And honestly, by the end of my time covering the Trump White House and covering the trade team, Lighthizer and I got along just fine. It was. I think he was just angry. Honestly, I think it was a human response, and on top of that, having Trump as a boss.
I see. Fantastic. It's interesting. It's always the most absurd moments that enters your memory more clearly. But I bet there are more pleasant moments in your journalism career, during all those years. I wonder, are there other memorable moments that you would like to share a little bit with our audience?
On the China front, it goes back a long way. I mean, so I covered with another reporter, Helene Cooper, who's now in the New York Times. We covered Clinton's negotiation with Zhu Rongji over joining the World Trade Organization. And if your audience may remember, Clinton sent Zhu Rongji back empty-handed and had never intended actually to sign a deal with him, although Zhu had come looking for an agreement. And Helene and I Helene and I broke that story, which had a major impact, I would say, on U.S.-China relations, because Zhu Rongji went back empty-handed, but he was seen as sort of the martyr. There was a huge amount of pressure on Clinton to, retract what he had done, and pretty much that's what happened. That was a very interesting kind of experience. Also, trailing around with the Clinton team as they're trying to sign or trying to negotiate with the Chinese is very interesting. I mean, one time we were in New Zealand for a meeting of the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, an early one where there was side deals between the Americans and the Chinese. And I remember some of the Clinton team bungee jumping, for instance. I was invited. The U.S. Trade Representative at the time, Charlene Barshevsky, is Jewish, as am I, and it was also over the Jewish holidays, and we wound up going to temple in New Zealand, in a New Zealand temple where there were Maori who had married in and were singing at the top of their lungs all the Jewish prayers. It was, totally fascinating. And then, move forward to China. I love whatever one thinks about the government, whatever thinks about the party. I loved being in China. It was just a great experience. I particularly enjoyed going to, what are called the fourth tier cities. Just sort of a normal place where most Westerners don't get to go. I considered it a huge triumph if I got to a place that didn't have a McDonald's. I found it impossible to find a place without a Kentucky Fried Chicken. But I really enjoyed it. So yeah, so there were negative parts about dealing in China. Being trailed by security people was awful. The pressure that I would see that security people would put on my Chinese counterparts was enormous. For me, I didn't really honestly think much would happen to me, but for the Chinese nationals who worked for the Wall Street Journal, they faced a lot of pressure, and some of it was just simple social pressure put on their family not to cooperate with a Western journalist. It was very fascinating, but it was difficult to deal with that kind of reporting challenge.
Right. We're going to turn to sort of the impact of deterioration of U.S.-China relations on journalism a little later on, but I wanted to focus on sort of the U.S.-China trade relations a little more. As you know, currently China is still running behind on its phase one trade deal promises, achieving roughly only 2/3 of the purchasing target, according to data compiled by the Peterson Institute. So how do you expect the Biden administration to hold China accountable to the 2-year deal?
Well, I don't think they will. To start with, we're, God, what are we, 1 month away from the end of the 2-year period? So I mean, they're just not going to hit the targets. I think what they will try to do is to negotiate new targets, for the next couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
I think an easy way out of all this, which I think might be the way forward, is for China to certify the Boeing 737 MAX. It's one of the few countries, one of the very few major countries not to do it. You buy a bunch of airplanes, that's a lot of money. And it is a traditional way in which the Chinese government tries to, cozy up to the American government, right, is to buy airplanes. So I think I would expect that sort of kind of resolution. And also, I think for both sides, the purchase part was always the easy part, right? I mean, the Chinese government's willing to buy more stuff. That's never really been the issue. The other issues remain very, very difficult. But I think we'll see. I mean, I think we're seeing a somewhat of an easing of tension between the two countries. Nothing substantive, but at least kind of the rhetoric and so on is toned down a little bit. We'll see after Biden and Xi Jinping talk. But I think trade has become an area where perhaps the two countries might be able to cooperate, or at least negotiate, and they'll have their differences, but kind of within the normal bounds of a trade dispute.
I see. And I think one sort of, to take a step back, according to my conversations with most economists, I would say they would agree that using tariff as a tool to address trade imbalances or even the broader US-China economic relations is kind of a blunt way to go about it. But what's a little surprising to me is Ambassador Tai, as far as we can tell, still kind of remained ambivalent when she was asked whether the administration planned to ease some of the tariffs on Chinese goods as a potential way to, say, reduce inflationary pressures on the United States economy. How do you expect the Biden administration's approach to trade to be different from the previous administration, or do you think it's going to largely remain the same?
Well, I agree with you. I've been surprised also. I mean, I had an interview with Lighthizer, the last U.S. trade rep, right before the end of the last administration. And he recommended that they can keep all the tariffs, even though when he was trade rep, he didn't really, at least, for most of the trade war, he didn't really intend to keep all the tariffs. He intended to keep them until China started, keeping its promises, essentially, and rolling them back. But he recommended they keep all the tariffs. And I thought to myself, well, okay, fine, whatever. You're the last administration. It doesn't really matter. And I've been amazed, honestly, how they've kept all the tariffs, particularly as you point out. Inflation's picking up. It's kind of it's not because of tariffs, but tariffs raise prices, right? And so it would be an easy way to kind of reduce prices. I think why it hasn't happened is all about politics. I mean, at first, I think Ambassador Tai isn't that much different in her view of China and how to approach trade than Ambassador Lighthizer was. But secondly, the politics are very difficult. There is a bipartisan agreement about China. The view in Washington in a bipartisan fashion is very negative on China. China's a cheater. That China doesn't live up to its deal, its obligations, that the trade deficit's too wide, and so on and so forth. So it'd be very hard to roll it back. And also, as we're getting into near the midterm election, and the Democrats seem to be doing very poorly at the moment, it's kind of the last thing they need is another issue that might alienate, a substantial number of voters.
I see. And on to sort of broader context of U.S.-China relations, to what extent do you think the other side of the coin, the Chinese side, is responsible, or especially Xi Jinping himself or the Chinese leadership more broadly is responsible for the current state of affairs of U.S.-China relations? How much responsibility should China bear?
Oh, at least as much as the U.S. I mean, this isn't just, the common sort of view is that things were fine. Trump screwed everything up. He was too hard on China, so on and so forth. But no, that's not remotely fair. I mean, the U.S. is reacting to changes in China, not just that China's growing more powerful, although that's obviously part of it, but the sense that Chinese companies and the Chinese government pressure U.S. companies into handing over valuable technology, that they, will buy kind of raw materials, but not, finished goods and manufacturing. There are any number of issues, and also not insignificantly, the way China acts on human rights, the way China acts on security issues. There are one issue after another where China has changed the rules of the game as much as the Americans. So it's definitely on both sides.
Right. And I think even now, in general, there's a consensus in DC that, the relations between China and U.S. Requires some sort of rethinking, quite different from the previous years when it was all friendly. But I remember during the Trump administration years, several senior U.S. officials, especially Mr. Pompeo and Mr. Pence, made extremely hawkish and ideology-driven statement about China. Stop basically just, shy of explicitly calling for regime change. I wonder, based on your information, was that possibility ever seriously entertained by the administration, or was it more for show, for rhetoric, so to speak?
Well, I don't think they seriously had a plan for replacing the Communist Party. But yes, I agree with you. I mean, Matt Pottinger, the Deputy National Security Advisor, was giving speeches in Mandarin, essentially calling for an uprising. So they were giving encouragement, but I don't think there was any plan. I mean, there's certainly no plan for military action or anything of that sort. I think that is one of the, I was talking about the ways this administration is like the last. There are definite differences. That's one. I mean, you don't hear language like that. The other major difference, there's two other major differences. One, they are trying to work with allies, to kind of a united front strategy. The last administration, for the most part, didn't. They did on some areas of national security, but generally they didn't when it came to China. And also there is this effort, to strengthen the U.S. economy and the U.S. technology. The last administration talked about it, but didn't do a heck of a lot on it. So there are differences. I mean, why it looks the same is a lot of the tactics are the same, and they haven't ended the Trump tactics. That's been the surprise.
Right. And, as you mentioned, so far, we have not seen the kind of reset under President Biden in a way that many previously had expected. But speaking of the future trajectory of U.S.-China relations, what's your expectation there? Is it going to be a free fall in the future? Are we going to bottom up soon and then, come back to a new normal or a new baseline? What do you expect the trajectory to be in the near future?
Well, one thing I just want to say, you had said there wasn't a reset on the U.S. side as was expected. There also wasn't a reset on the Chinese side as was expected as well, right? I mean, it could have been from either country. I mean, I think at the moment, I think we're going to see a little easing of tension, but we are in a very different state of largely confrontation. The question is, I mean, in our book, we talked about edging to a new Cold War. I can make the argument we're in it now, or one could say, it's not the right metaphor, but it is an era of confrontation. And the question becomes making sure that confrontation remains economic, technological, and not military. I mean, that is a surprising challenge. The idea that these two countries could conceivably be headed to war, two nuclear armed countries, is just, stuff of the apocalypse. And that is, number one, the biggest challenge, to make sure that it doesn't edge into that, which, remember, it never happened, even during the actual Cold War with the Soviet Union, where it was mostly a military confrontation, and both sides had at least were level-headed enough to make sure that it didn't spill over. And hopefully these two countries will do the same. And I would expect that also. I have no idea how the Taiwan issue gets resolved. And that is, without a doubt, the issue that could throw things terribly out of whack.
Right. And speaking of sort of getting the balance right, I feel like one unfortunate consequences of worsening U.S.-China relations was the expulsion of reporters from both sides, actually, but especially the Chinese expulsion of U.S. reporters and foreign reporters, including Ms. Ling Wei herself. So as a former journalist, how do you expect the kind of the lack of on-the-ground information to affect the quality of China reporting, in this era?
Yeah, no, I think it'll hurt it enormously. China looks so different from 10,000 miles away. It looks, in my view, it looks more formidable the further away you get from it. The closer you get there, you see all the problems. It's, like any other country. I mean, there are problems. You can see them. They're almost instantaneously obvious to you when you're there. It doesn't seem that way when you're not there. I think it's in China's interest also to have more realistic reporting about the country. I think, and additionally, I think it's an easy way for the two countries again to sort of ease tensions a bit. To have a couple more reporters go back, U.S. reporters go back in there. I personally have no problem with Chinese reporters in the U.S. I think that's all to the good. The more they know about the U.S., I think that's, generally a good thing. For Ling, it's been a very tough situation, right? Her family is in China. She's enjoying living in New York. She had lived in New York before she went back. She's a U.S. citizen. Still, her family's in China. That's quite it's not just a professional problem. It is a family problem, right? She was expelled, right? And not just expelled, she, banished basically from the country.
Right. So tough issues, but hopefully things will turn for the better. Yeah. Final question of the day. So now you have completed a celebrated career at Wall Street Journal for 39 years. Can you tell us a little bit about your current plan for your retirement and any future writing projects that you have in mind that we can look forward to?
Well, I hope to do writing. I haven't figured out yet what to do. I have my first granddaughter, who's 17 months old and is as adorable as you can imagine. And my daughter and granddaughter and son-in-law just moved to Washington, D.C., where I live. So at the moment, what I'm doing is helping out with childcare. And so, but I hope, to get involved in some kind of writing, over the next 6 months, say.
I see. Thank you so much, Mr. Davids. It's been great talking to you. And thank you so much for sharing all the insights.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
感谢您来到由我Lizzi 为您带来的今日华尔街频道。在看过节目之后，如果喜欢，请别忘了为节目点赞，也请您在留言区留下您对节目的见解和意见。如果您是频道会员的话，我们会在第一时间回复您的留言，解答您的疑问。另外，如果还没有订阅的话，请记得要订阅频道，并且打开订阅按钮旁边的小铃铛，这样您就可以在第一时间收到节目发布的最新信息了。再次感谢您观看今日华尔街频道，我是Lizzi，我们下次再会。